right. The other thing we were going to talk about was single brood chambers. There's been a lot of interest in single brood chamber management that's been rapidly spreading to all over, the United States. That got started years ago by Ian Stepler is the biggest name, but there's a couple Canadian beekeepers that have been doing it. I'm trying to think the guy that's in Ontario. We had him at the state meeting a few years ago. But the single brood chamber management was kind of has caught on. I've been doing it for probably 5 years now. Every year increasing the numbers of hives that I transfer over to single brood. This year, I'm finally 100% single brood chamber, starting from the spring, going into the winter now. And it's a new thing. I mean, you're starting to see more and more people talking about it and going from there. But just wanted to kind of do a little discussion here about single brood chambers, what it is, why it's useful, and why it can be done. You've all heard about using nukes and overwintering nukes, and that was a big thing, when it first started happening, and everybody started doing it. And now there's some people doing it, but it's kind of leveled off, and people found their own little niche. Single brood chambers are basically overwintering larger nukes. And that's all it is. Essentially, with a single brood chamber, we start off in the spring with a single 8-frame deep or a 10-frame deep. And instead of adding a second chamber to it, we add a queen excluder and then multiple honey supers. Essentially, if you look at the math and the biology of honeybees, the queen only lays X amount of eggs per day. And whether it's left to right or up and down, it's the same amount of eggs. So the theory is that a single 8-frame deep or 10-frame deep is going to provide more than enough room for that queen to lay and not have to worry about bees backfilling. And then from there, with the honey supers on top of that, that's where all the excess nectar is going. One of the things that we often see with a double brood chamber with 2 deeps and what causes swarming is the backfilling of the brood chambers with nectar. So even with a double brood chamber, you could run into the same issues that you do with a single brood chamber. The biggest issue that everybody's concerned about is swarming. And even in a double brood chamber, you can minimize that swarming by just adding a whole bunch of supers and giving them place to store that honey. So in the springtime, she's going to lay queens. And many of you that run doubles or even all mediums, if you look at the brood nest itself, where it is within the structure of the colony, in a double deep, the outside frames are typically just honey, or pollen. And the brood nest itself is split between the 2 deeps. So you might have 4 or 5 frames on the bottom, 4 or 5 frames up on top. In a single brood chamber, it's wall-to-wall brood. And then your honey is above the queen excluder. So the key there in the springtime is to make sure you add enough supers so that none of that honey gets put below in the brood chamber itself. And if you add enough space, what you actually end up doing, you could minimize swarming and increase your honey yields because you are managing that space effectively. So in the spring on my single brood chambers, I put a queen excluder typically about mid-March, and then I'll add 3 or 4 supers per colony. And my yields of honey have actually increased with single brood chambers versus those with doubles, because a lot of times with doubles, we think there's plenty of space. We expect the bees to move down. They have this room, that room. We put 1 or 2 supers on top and they still swarm. And that's because they continue to plug up that brood chamber with honey. So providing more space up top gives you that flexibility, and it actually minimizes swarming. I had very few swarms from my single brood chambers this year because of that technique. Moving forward into the spring and summer, into the summer months, once honey is pulled off It's also much easier to manage those colonies for mite control. I don't have to go through 2 boxes. If I'm looking for queens, I only have to go through 1 box instead of 2 or 3 or 4. I could put candy on them. I could feed them easier. Everything's just on that lower box. There's no lifting involved other than the honey supers itself, which is fantastic. I was helping Charlie last week, and I hurt my back lifting those 500-pound supers that he had on top, those double deeps, which is good. They were heavy, but they were heavy, and that's a good way. Beekeepers always have bad backs and bad knees, and that's why. So it helps minimize that. And then moving into the fall, in the winter months, it's also nicer too, because again, I could add supers or take them off very easily if I need to using a queen excluder. Everything is stayed down into that single deep. My mite treatments are easier. We actually now, instead of having to stand up the whole time checking bees, I carry a bucket around. My single deeps are right at a level where I sit on my bucket. I can check my hive, and then I just move my bucket to the next hive and go from there. They're on cinder blocks. So people are cautious when trying new things. For years and decades, double deeps was the way to go. That was what was used in Pennsylvania and a lot of other places in the United States. And everybody preaches that you need 80 to 100 pounds of honey to overwinter a colony, and in reality, that's only an amount that's needed for the double deeps. I could overwinter a single deep with 60 to 70 pounds of honey. I could overwinter a 5-frame nuke with 25 pounds of honey, and then of course I just add candy boards if necessary to do that. In fact, even this fall was a perfect example. Here in southwestern Pennsylvania, we essentially had a failed fall crop. I mean, it was just too dry. The goldenrod didn't really produce. I actually, I kind of thought that was going to happen. So instead of putting multiple supers on hives, I put 1 super on every single hive body that I had. And there was just enough nectar flow that they filled each one of those supers, and they backfilled their brood chamber. So I didn't have to feed this fall, which is fantastic. Had I used a double deep, I probably would have ended up having to feed them to get them up to weight. So another advantage of that single brood chamber is even in a small, a weak fall flow, there's an advantage that you don't have to feed as much, if at all. So, and I actually we're going to be extracting on Sunday. So I expect, normally we'd probably get 2,000 or 3,000 pounds of honey in the fall. I might get 1,000 this year, which is still better than I expected. See, there's a question here. Using the single brood chamber method in the winter with a queen excluder and honey supers, will they break cluster to move up and use the honey? Yeah, so we don't use the queen excluders in the wintertime. So my wintering is just 1 single deep. That's it. So the springtime, we add a queen excluder and then the supers. We harvest those supers and they stay in a single deep throughout the summer months. And then in the fall, we put the queen excluder back on with whatever supers we want. And then we pull those supers off and the queen excluder off, and we overwinter as a single deep. And that's it. It's a very straightforward process. It's not complicated. Probably the most complicated aspect of it would be the springtime to try to minimize swarming, but that's just management in general. We don't, some people will argue that a single brood chamber will swarm more than a double brood chamber, and I would argue the opposite of that. If managed correctly, a single brood chamber will swarm less because we're adding more room for the honey to be stored, versus in the double deep, we kind of suspect there's lots of room and the bees end up swarming anyways. So I've got some good slideshows on that, and perhaps maybe next spring, Ken, we could get together and actually do a good PowerPoint and maybe even get out into the bee yard and do stuff that way when we're allowed to do things in a group. But the single brood chamber stuff is interesting. Ian Stepler on YouTube is a really good resource for that. He's a great guy. He's very knowledgeable. He's up in Canada. He does overwinter inside, so there are some differences, but the management of it, when he makes a split, when he doesn't make a split, is kind of, it's everywhere. You could do it anywhere. One of the things often too, as far as swarm prevention is concerned with single deeps, one of the management techniques is that in the springtime, if your colony is going gangbusters, and I did this year, the spring, and you're looking to increase your colonies. Let's say you have 5 hives that overwintered and you'd like to go to 10. The nice thing about single brood chamber is a couple ways you could do it. If you have doubles, split them, and now you're down into singles, and you can go from there. Or what I did this year is on some of my really strong singles, I added a second deep, let the second deep get drawn out, full of eggs, brood, etc. Took it off, added a queen, and I basically harnessed that swarming energy to produce another colony. And it was still early enough that I could add supers to both colonies and get additional honey. So lots of different ways to do it. You can play with it however you want to manage it in your area. There's another question. It says, have entrances for the bees to use in the honey supers. That's up to you. I don't. I have an upper entrance, so the single brood chamber, they're only going through one single deep into their honey supers, whether it's 2, 3, 4, however. If I do get up into the 3rd or 4th level of supers, I will have an upper entrance. So the bees do what they want. Sometimes they end up using it. Sometimes they just still use the main entrance. Some of the old time beekeepers will drill holes in their supers as entrances and ventilation. I don't see a difference in it. Again, that's one of those, it's a management technique that you develop. One of the things I often, preach about, and I say preach because that's what I do, is that, we focus too much on the minutia instead of the overall management. How big does that hole have to be? Is it 2 inches to the left of the handle or 2 inches to the right? What if I make it too big? What if I make it too small? How many do I need? Don't worry about that type of stuff. Find and understand the biology of it. If you understand the biology of the bees and how to manage that biology over the course of the seasons, the rest of that is just minutia. It'll work with you. It may not work, and you'll work your way through that. Charlie and I do some things very similar. We don't do some things very differently. But the main common theme is that we understand what the bees are doing, and we adjust accordingly to what works for us within our own management style. And you have a very active club, and you've got a lot of knowledgeable beekeepers up there, which is fantastic. And the one thing I always tell people at my meetings is that, I'll tell you how I do it, but I'll also tell you how 6 other people do it, because what works for me may not work for you. And ultimately, your management style is going to be one that you develop on your own. You might take a little bit of what I say, you might take a little bit of what Charlie says and Cece says, and then mash it all together and develop your own management. And there's nothing wrong with that in that case. Cece says, speaking of Cece, do you think the single deep brood chamber for overwintering and during nectar flow would work for single medium brood chamber as well? Ooh, yeah, you're one of them, aren't you, Cece? You're an 8-frame medium person. Bob Tatro is too, and I bust his chops all the time for that. But Bob has overwintered a single 8-frame medium. You could do it. He's done it by also not only letting him backfill, but adding a candy board. I think at a minimum, I would probably, if you're using mediums, whether it's 10-frame or 8-frame, I would probably go as low as 2, just for the clustering space.
You're talking about 8-frame instead of 10-frame. I was just.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, either 8 or 10. Well, so you were saying. Hold on, let me read your question again.
Yeah, no,
you said
instead of the deep, using 10-frame mediums.
Yeah, yeah, you could do that. You'd need to do. You'd have to adjust it accordingly. Like so, I use 8 frame. Well, I use 8 frame deeps and 8 frame mediums as my single brood chambers. I'm slowly transferring over to 8 frame deeps because it's just a couple of reasons. One, I think they overwinter better in 8 frames than they do 10. There's a lot of wasted space in the 10 frame. And one of the things that some of the beekeepers, like Tom Seeley and some of these other big gurus are talking about is that the bees we keep now are not the bees that our parents kept in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Very different. They're not, the cluster size isn't as big. They're not as reproductive. The queens aren't living as long. And typically in a 10 frame deep, you see a lot of wasted space on the outside. Those 2 frames on either side that get filled with honey, they rarely get used. I mean, that honey just sits there and it gets old and the wax gets old. That's a waste of resources. And I'm finding that with an 8 frame, they're utilizing that space, they're utilizing the resources, all that good stuff. But yeah, I think with mediums, you could certainly use that configuration the same way. I don't think you can get away with a single medium. You'd have to go with 2 mediums to have that equivalent brood space, etc. Does that make sense?
Steve,
Kinda. Yeah.
Rebecca, do you have a question for Steve? I say you have your hand up. Okay, Steve, another question.
Yep.
What are you doing for winterization now with single?
Yes. So a lot of that's a good question too. And it actually for winterization, one of the things I see a lot of people doing now too is they're already starting the winterizing process. My personal opinion is it's way too early. Our weather's fluctuating. The bees are still extremely active. There's a lot of because of the temperature swings, the bees are also foraging. Well, they're foraging, they're out flying, they're doing their thing. When we winterize, I see people wrapping hives already. I see them doing upper ventilations, a whole bunch of that stuff. Generally, it's not recommended to do any type of a winterizing process until the temperatures drop into steadily in the 40s. That at that point, that the bees are pretty much in their dormant state. They're not going to fly as often, if at all. And at that point, with the temperatures being colder and more stable, you could regulate the hive a little bit better. As far as a single brood chamber is concerned, my winterization is very simple. I will put a candy board on top of the colony. The candy board is the same dimension as the hive top, and it carries about 17 to 20 pounds of candy that I mix up. It's essentially 8 parts sugar to 1 part water with some pollen mixed in to about 1 to 3% of weight to give them a little protein. And then between the candy board and the top of the hive body, I put a popsicle stick in each corner. That's my winterization. If it has a screen bottom board, the screen bottom board stays open, but I've also been transitioning to solid bottom boards. I don't think screen bottom boards are really worth their weight in anything. They became popular about 10, 15 years ago as a way to help reduce mite loads, but it only shows about 10 to 15% reduction in mite drop. It doesn't really help your mite populations at all. Now the focus is saying, well, okay, it may not work for mites, but it really helps with ventilation. You don't necessarily need that much ventilation in a colony. The biggest thing is just to make sure that they have the food they need, make sure that there's a windbreak, make sure that they're protected from extreme colds in terms of, you want sun on them in the wintertime. If you have a heavily shaded colony now, when the leaves drop, it might get a little bit of sun, but certainly the more sun in the winter, the better. So I don't wrap. I don't do quilt boards. I just do a little bit of the popsicle sticks in the corners to allow some of that moist air to escape, and that's it. I don't think that wrapping is needed in Pennsylvania. Our temperatures, our weather is just too all over the place. Even up in northwestern PA. I mean, you guys are in a snow belt up there. it's not needed. If you have good wind protection, even if you get a lot of snow, that snow acts as an insulation. I think of when you wrap hives, it reminds me of these warm days that we get in the springtime or the late winter where it's 60, 70 degrees outside, but it's still chilly in the house, right? And the furnace kicks on. The same thing with the bees is where if you wrap them, it actually can add several days. By the time they warm up, your warm spell might be over and they go to do a cleansing flight and it's back down to 30 degrees or whatever it may be. So wrapping has its place up in Canada and the northern states. Once you get below New York, I don't think we have a need for it. I get people that are wrapping it down in North Carolina and Tennessee, and we don't have those kind of winters anymore. So keep it simple. As beekeepers, we like to do these fads and whatever's being talked about on Facebook and the internet, that's what we got to try it and do it. And I'm actually working on my second book now about management, and one of the things that we talk about extensively is that we've lost sight of how to manage our bees. We just want to buy whatever somebody's telling us to buy on the internet. We want to do what the internet deities are telling us to do on Facebook pages, but we're not learning how to manage our colonies. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off of that for now. So
check the chat there, Steve.
Let me see. I was getting notifications and it shut off on me. Let's see here.
I asked about mouse guards.
Oh, okay. Why is it? Oh, okay. I'm not seeing the chat's not showing up for me right now. What was the question about mouse guards, Ken?
Do you use them?
I use mouse guards year round. I do not use entrance reducers. I don't swap them out. I use the stainless steel one-piece mouse guards that Man Lake sells. They have 3/8 inch holes, 3/8 of an inch holes drilled throughout the face of them. That goes on whenever the hive is installed. They get screwed in place, and that's it. Whoa. I don't worry about entrance reducers. I checked a bunch of my hives the other day, and the bees actually propolized shut the holes that they wanted. They have the entrance that they need, and that's it. That's one less thing I have to worry about. I don't have to swap things out. I don't have to flip this, flip that. The mouse guard is on, and that's the end of the story. So again, keeping it simple. Don't overthink it. It's really not, it's not something that, I always tell people to think about a wild colony, whether it's in a house or a tree or whatever it may be. Nobody's out there opening up the entrance, closing up the entrance, flipping things, rotating boxes. They exist. Certainly we need to manage our colonies a little bit more because we're not keeping them in trees. We're keeping them in hives, which are, 5 inches thinner and don't have the decayed bottom that you would have in a tree. But besides that, with entrances, just, keep it simple. The bees will manage it. If you look at a wild colony ever, and you have the ability to watch their entrance, you'll actually see that they open and close that entrance using propolis year round. They'll open it when they open it, and they want to close it, they'll close it, and that's it. So yeah, I just keep them on all year. There was a question that says, don't I find a lot of dead bees piled up inside the hive behind the mouse guards? Generally not. I will go through them probably in February. When I put my mouse guards on, I only screw the one end in so they actually pivot. And I'll actually go through and take a stick and clean out any dead bees that may pile up. But because of the multiple entrance holes across that mouse guard, generally speaking, the bees are able to clear out the hive pretty easily. I don't see any excess pile up. And the other nice thing too is about with those mouse guards is the holes are elevated up just a tad. So if there is a layer of dead bees, any access that the bees need, they could walk over the dead to get out. So it's not really blocking the entrance in any way. So.
Good information. Any other questions? Is it too late to go to single brood right now?
Yes. Yeah. Do not do anything now. whatever you're in now, do it now. Next year, basically what I'll tell people is come dandelions. I always talk about dandelions being that key indicator of rotating boxes if you're if you're the one that rotates. Dandelions is when you get ready to add supers if you haven't already. Dandelions is when your bees have made it through the winter. So dandelions is also a time when you're going to have drones available. So if you have a double deep and you want to try single brood chamber management, that's the time to split them. Now, of course, this year we had snow in May, so that was out the window. But typically, dandelions is your safe date to start doing the more aggressive manipulations. I see people rotating boxes in March when the first 60 degree day comes out, and it just gets a little crazy. So, be observant. Those nature tells us what we can and can't do. This year was a prime example too with the goldenrod. If you paid attention, you guys got more rain than we did, but with goldenrod, it failed this year. It bloomed everywhere. It just didn't produce. And the reason it didn't produce is because during basically the month of July, when the plant is developing, it needs a lot of moisture there's a structure in the plant called the nectary, and the nectary is what produces the nectar. And it needs that moisture in July and early August prior to the plant fully blooming in order to produce the nectar. And this year we had no rain down here until mid-August. The goldenrod bloomed late, but it was too late. There weren't, they got very little off of it. We should have had a lot more had we had the rain early. So, biological indicators are very important when it comes to beekeeping, more so than calendar beekeeping is.
Excellent. Anybody else have any questions? Steve,